The sky was all salt blue and quiet wind, broken only by the low croak of a raven and the breath of the dust. Willa sat cross-legged in the dirt beneath a lean-limbed juniper, its crooked branches casting long, gnarled shadows that jittered across the trail. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, not after what had happened 3 nights ago when the wagon rolled on without her. She still wore the same faded calico dress. Grit seamed into the stitching. One boot was too tight, the other nearly worn through. A biscuit crust lay in her apron pocket, kept for later, though she'd forgotten what later even meant. Days had slipped by. Time didn't pulse steady out here. It drifted, loose and lonely. Buzzards circled in the heat-glazed sky, but they didn't descend. Something about Willa told even scavengers to keep a respectful distance. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting beneath that tree when hoofbeats cracked the silence like thunder behind glass. Her spine straightened, even as her hands stayed in her lap. Fear was a quick breath, trapped behind her ribs, but she didn't move. Whoever it was would either ride by or do worse. But the hoofbeats slowed. A tall, horse-mottled roan with a white blaze came into view. Then the rider, a man shaped by sun and wind and silence. He dismounted like gravity, had learned to be careful around him. He said nothing as his boots sank into the trail dust. Willa looked up. Not scared, not hopeful either, just ready. The man crouched, elbows on knees, hat low over weathered eyes. He looked at her the way some folks regarded old trees quietly, like they were waiting to be spoken to first. Then, in a voice like gravel half-polished by creek water, he said, "Let's go, Willa." She didn't ask how he knew her name. He didn't outstretch a hand. She stood, and just like that, she left the trail behind. No past tied to her ankles, no words weighing them both down. He lifted her onto the saddle like she weighed no more than a sack of flour, then climbed up behind her. They turned toward the ridgeline, the sun lowering its heat behind them. The juniper swayed once more in the breezeite's crooked limbs, waving goodbye or good luck. Willa didn't look back. The land already had. Ellis Roar didn't speak much, not in the presence of cowhands or clergymen, and certainly not to stray children left by the roadside. But when he found the girl in the dust, eyes fierce beneath a curtain of soot and silence, he paused longer than he meant to. "Let's go, Willa," he said, low and sure, as though the name had always belonged to her. She didn't ask how he knew, didn't ask anything at all, just stood, brushed off her trousers, and followed the man who didn't reach for her hand but never once looked back to see if she trailed him. She would remember that simple act for the rest of her life, that she didn't need to be tugged forward, just trusted. Back at Redwood Ranch, the quiet followed them indoors like an old friend. Ellis poured into a basin and slid it across a wooden table. He left a cloth and walked out. By the time he returned, Willa had washed her face and hands and was drying them with sharp, efficient motions. She didn't thank him, not yet. He didn't need her to. That night, he ladled beans into a chipped bowl, set it in front of her, then took his place across the hearth. The fire popped, and Ellis's dog Barley rested his graying muzzle on crossed paws, flicking an ear toward the girl but never stirring further. Across the flames, Willa ate slowly, every movement measured. 3 mornings passed before Ellis handed her a pair of gloves and gestured toward the corral. No words, just work, and Willa responded in kind, matching her steps to his shadow. She learned the weight of a hammer, listened for the hollow echo of loose fence posts, felt the change in the wind before the chickens scattered. With every lesson taught through silence and action, the weight in her chest lightened. Home wasn't always cradle songs and sweetness. Sometimes it smelled of saddle oil and sounded like nothing at all. One evening, as storms circled in the hills, Ellis opened an old cedar trunk and pulled out a long calf-hide coat. He didn't explain, just draped it gently over Willa's shoulders and returned to the fire. It smelled faintly of juniper and worn thread. Willa ran her fingers along the cuffs, a memory not her own stitched into every seam. She never cried. But that night she pulled the coat tighter around herself, and Ellis, watching from the shadows of the hearth, gave the smallest of nods. The ranch didn't get louder after Willa arrived, just fuller. Redwood Ranch sat like an old hymn on the horizon, steady, quiet, and carved by calloused hands and time. The gates didn't creak when they opened. They didn't need to announce themselves. They simply let the dust blow through, as if the land had learned patience. Willa sat on the fence rail like she belonged there. Not because anyone said she could, but because no one had said she couldn't. Across the corral, Ellis moved slow, methodical, checking tack, tightening rope, adjusting nothing and everything with a kind of reverent purpose. He didn't ask if she slept. She didn't ask why he gave her room. They had found different ways to speak. Her boots barely grazed the worn wood below when she swung her feet. The faint jingle of Ellis's spurs was the only sound carving the late morning hush. The land breathed easy now. A biscuit had been on the table this morning, still warm under a cotton cloth. No plate, no ceremony. Just waiting, like her. She remembered thinking it might be a test, that if she reached for it too fast, it'd vanish. But it hadn't. It was soft. And when she bit into it, the world tilted a little toward warm. "You finished the north fence?" Ellis asked, not looking up. "Yes, sir." The words came quiet, but not unsure. "Post held? It's not leaning anymore." He gave a slight nod. Approval was never dressed P in praise. But she felt it just the same. Later, the wind picked up a bit, stirring stray leaves by the root cellar. She pulled Ellis's sister's coat tighter around her shoulders. It carried a long-ago scentwood smoke, sage, something like goodbye, but settled into comfort over time. In the fields, Benji chased a runaway chicken, giggling until the bird turned on him and he stumbled into the dust. Willa didn't laugh, just smiled with the corners of her eyes. When the sun dipped a little lower, she reached up and lifted the paintbrush again. The half-dried sign swayed from the gatepost, its letters still fresh. Redwood Ranch, Roar, Willa, Benji. Not scratched in hasta painted with care. Ellis stood beside her then, watching without speaking. "You think it'll hold?" Willa asked. "It already has," he replied. The wind caught the oak leaves in a hush, and Willa thought to herself for the first time, not with doubt, but with quiet certainty, this was home. Not because it was given, but because it was grown. And she smiled, paint-streaked hand resting on her name. The morning mist clung low to the pasture, curling between fence posts like breath held too long. Willa woke before the rooster again, boots already laced when Ellis stepped onto the porch with his coffee. He didn't greet her. He never did. Instead, he tilted his head toward the shed, just once, and she followed. They worked in silence, fixing a broken gate hinge that had hung crooked for weeks. Ellis passed her the hammer without explanation, and Willa knew where each nail should go. Her hands, though small, had learned to speak his language: pressure, patience, precision, no need for words. She liked it that way. By mid-morning, she led the horses to the creek while Ellis mucked the stalls. Her braid whipped in the wind, scraps of hair pulling loose as she ran her palm along each mare's flank. She whispered their names into the quiet. "Junebug, Sorrel, Miss T." She didn't need anyone to hear them but the horses. Later, when she brought Ellis a tin lunch of beans and bacon, he handed her a leather bridle from the hook. No praise, no instruction, just trust. She spent the next hour oiling the worn straps, careful with the buckles, deliberate with her cloth. It felt like ceremony. In the afternoon sun, Willa watched Ellis mend a section of fence. He drove the post straight with rhythmic thuds, shoulders steady like clockwork. She studied him, noting his stance, how he moved his weight, not just strength, but knowing. Every plank placed was a decision made. Then came the thunderclouds. A storm bloomed over the ridge without warning. Rain fell sharp-sliced across the porch when she ran to close the barn doors. Ellis was still outside, guiding calves toward shelter, drenched but unfazed. Willa hesitated only a moment. Then she grabbed the pitchfork and followed. Together, knee-deep in mud, they shifted hay, guided strays, locked everything down. Not a word passed between them. Only glances. Only motion. When it was finally still again, Ellis peeled his coethus late sister sand, draped it around Willa's shoulders. It fell like a curtain down her legs, too big by half, smelling of saddle oil and cedar. She looked up. He didn't meet her gaze, just ruffled her wet hair once, then walked inside. And for Willa, that was louder than anything a father could have said. She stayed a moment longer beneath the eaves, eyes following the raindrops like falling stars. Somewhere in the silence, something had settled. Not explained, not offered, but shared. Rain smelled like iron. Willa huddled in the barn's shadow, arms wrapped tight around her ribs. The wind didn't yell. It whispered something cold and bone-deep. She watched fat droplets hammer the tin roof like booth heels on saloon planks. Her shirt clung to her back, damp and itchy, but she didn't move. Storms were like people, best left alone until they passed. Ellis had gone to town before the clouds broke open. Left her a bucket of oats, fresh kindling, and one plain nod. He hadn't said stay inside. He hadn't said wait, but it was there, all the same. She respected silence too much to need more than that. Lightning split the ridgeline. She flinched just slightly. Then she saw the coat, hanging on the barn wall like it had been waiting for her all along. Beige calf hide, worn smooth at the sleeves. Big buttons, wooden, mismatched. The collar still smelled faintly of smoke, but not the acrid kind. Campfire, maybe? Or something warmer. She reached up slowly and slipped it from its peg. It was heavy, bigger than it should have been for her, swallowing her to her calves. But when she ran her fingers over the seams, the warmth caught, not just in her skin, somewhere else. They called it the sister's coat. She'd heard the ranch hands mention it once in a whisper that floated upward like dust. Said Miss Roar had worn it before. Willa didn't ask. She simply pulled it close and stepped out from under the barn roof. Rain hit her head first, then her cheeks, then her boots. The coat soaked quickly, but it held. And with every drop soaked in, it felt less like fabric and more like something alive, like Ellis had handed her a piece of himself. Without speaking, without explanation, without making her ask for it. Back inside, she stoked the fire and sat across from it with arms tucked into the coat's half-fixed lining. Benji stirred in his sleep on the cot, too small to know the storm had tried roiling the sky. She watched him, the fire, the rain, and for the first time since being left out on that trail, Willa didn't feel abandoned or borrowed again. She felt chosen and dry despite the storm. And when Ellis returned to a trench of hoof mud and fading thunder, he didn't mention the coat. He only nodded once, as if to say, "Good, it fits." The sun drooped low in a copper sky when Willa spotted movement on the trailer shaped small and alone, all dust and shadow. She Ned in her horse without thinking. Breath caught between ribs, like kindling waiting on a spark. The shape limped closer. A boy, hardly older than 7 or 8, dragging a torn flour sack behind him, more dragging than walking. Dirt clung to him like memory, and his hair stuck up in every direction, matted by wind and tears long since cried out. She remembered that walk. The silence of abandonment didn't echo it scraped. Willa dismounted, boots crunching on gravel, and stood in his path. No words. The boy stopped, eyes wide but dulled, like he'd stopped seeing clearly days ago. "Got a name?" she asked, voice low but steady. The same quiet Ellis always used, the one that left space for truth. He looked down. "Benji," he mumbled. "Just Benji." Willa nodded, just once. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out half a biscuit wrapped in cloth. No grand gesture, no pity. She held it out. He looked at it, looked at her. "You hungry?" she asked. He nodded. She handed it over. As he ate, she turned to her horse. "You ride?" He shook his head, crumbs escaping his lips. "That's all right, I'll ride. You sit behind." They didn't speak again for some time. She'd learned that trust wasn't earned in stories or smile-sit lived in proximity. In silence not broken by slaps or shouts. In warmth that didn't ask repayment. They reached Redwood Ranch just as stars prickled the sky. Ellis stood outside the barn, silhouetted in twilight. He didn't ask where the boy came from, just looked at Willa, then down at Benji, and gave a solemn nod. Later, by the fire, Benji clutched the tin whistle hanging from his belt. Didn't play it, just held it like a promise he wanted to believe in. Willa ladled stew into a chipped bowl and passed it over. "Here, Benji," she said. "Eat slow. You get more when you let it sit on your tongue." He obeyed. Ellis sat nearby, silent but present, polishing a bridle, the scrape of leather a rhythm older than words. That night, as coyotes cried far off and wind curled under the eaves, Willa unrolled a blanket beside her own and tucked Benji in. She didn't smile, didn't promise. She just said, "You're not alone now." And in that stillness between breath and sleep, Benji whispered back, "It's warm here, not just the fire." The quiet's warm, too. The sky over Redwood Ranch was the gray of burnished steel when Gideon Wexley returned, his silhouette sharp against the distant ridgeline. He rode like he owned the windhead high, boots polished, vest too clean for a man who claimed land by right of lineage. He came flanked by 2 men and burdened by a deed clutched like a preacher's gospel. Willa saw him first. She stood by the fence line, hammer in hand, tack nails looped on her belt like cartridge shells. Her braid whipped in the breeze. She didn't call for Ellis, didn't run. Just watched him ride, waiting until his shadow stretched long enough to fall at her boots. "Is Ellis Roar home?" Gideon asked, his voice oily, self-sure. "No." Willa didn't blink. Something in the way she stood feet apart. Shoulders squared, eyes dry, and dead steady-made. Gideon hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then he sneered and lifted a yellowed piece of parchment from his coat. "This land you stand on that eastern pasture you're so fond of it's mine," he said. "Old Wexley deed. Signed, sealed, and filed back when your guardian still cleaned stalls." She didn't look at the paper. She looked at the boots, scuffing her dirt boots that sank just a little into soil that knew its caretakers. "You think land answers to ink?" she asked, her voice soft as wind through dry grass. Gideon laughed, but it faltered. Willa stepped aside, revealing what had been half hidden behind her Ellis's long gun, resting against the fence. unloaded, but loyal as any guard dog. "If this land knows anything," she went on, "it knows who stays when the hard things come." Gideon scoffed, turned his horse, but his hands were white-knuckled on the reins. He rode off without looking back. The ranch exhaled. By the time Ellis returned that night, stars already blinking overhead, Willa had mended the fence. Gideon scuffed and fed Benji early. She said nothing of the encounter at first, only offered him a sour bush biscuit and a glance toward the fields. He studied her face, the set of her jaw. "You held," he said. She nodded. He handed her a folded parchment, crisp and clean, a revised guardianship, her name etched beside his. "You earned," he said. Later, she hung that paper on the barn wall beside her saddle. Not for show, but as quiet armor. Because Gideon would come again, and this time the land would answer him not in law or legacy, but in roots too deep for ink to reach. The wind drew slanted lines in the dusky air, tugging at the porch lantern that hung too loose. The ranch stood quiet, but firm redwoods fences stretching like arms into evening shadow. Willa stood near the barn's open door, small frame steady in her stance. A double-barrel shotgun rested in her hands like it belonged there. Not as a threat, as a truth. Gideon Wexley rode in with the thunder of someone who expected others to get out of his way. His polished boots hit the dirt with disdain. Two men flanked him, but Willa barely looked at them. Her eyes locked on Gideon's gray meeting blue, like steel against frost. "No man leaves a pasture unclaimed forever," he said, voice honeyed poison. "Land left wild don't stay loyal." Willa didn't raise the shotgun. She didn't tremble, just stood, boots planted, braid whipping behind her in the wind. Her voice didn't crack, didn't even rise. "You're not here for land. You're here to feel bigger than someone who won't flinch." Gideon's mouth twisted. "What does a child know of titles and deeds?" She angled the shotgun then, wrists sure. Somewhere behind her, Benji watched from the kitchen window, fingers pressed to the pane. One step forward from Gideon, and maybe she'd have to scare rather than speak, but not yet. "You think a name gives you ownership," she said plainly, "but names fade. Fences stand. I mended these, rode this range, lived it." Gideon's smirk faltered. His hat creaked beneath tightened fingers. The barn light caught the glint of polished steel butt Willa had no need to fire. Her calm was the louder weapon. "You can ride back," she said, "or you can ride through. But either way, I'll still be standing here tomorrow, and the day after." For a moment too long, the wind answered, instead of him. Finally, with a snort and a curse spat into the dust, Gideon turned. His boots stormed back to saddle iron. His voice came low, angry. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Willa whispered. Not to him, but to herself. As hooves retreated, the sun cracked through the clouds. Willa exhaled, fingers easing from the shotgun grip. Ellis appeared from the left field linesolant, rough hands tucked into worn coat pockets. He had seen it all, said nothing, but she met his eyes, and in their shared silence, a deed was sealed long before papers ever knew her name. Gray light filtered through the window pane of the ranch house, wan like winter sun through frost. Willa sat at the edge of the long kitchen table, feet barely brushing the floor, hands quietly folded. Across from her, Ellis stood leaning against the hearth, one hand cradling a tin mug. The fire crackled. Neither spoke. A soft knock. Then silence. Ellis crossed the room in deliberate steps, opened the door. Miriam Wells strode in, boots muddy, satchel slung over her shoulder. She nodded toward Willa, her presence as precise as her pen. "Morning," she said simply, and Willan, like the girl she was, months agonized back. Miriam unfastened the leather bindings on her satchel and removed a rolled parchment, securing it across the table's worn wood. Ellis didn't move, only watched. Willa swung her legs still, hands now resting on her lap. "It's ready," Miriam said, smoothing out the document with care. "Revised, signed by the county magistrate and myself, witnessed and stamped, as proper as the day is long." Willa stepped closer, her eyes scanning the inked lines a page of loops and legal words she barely understood. But at the bottom, her gaze caught on something she could read plain. Willa Thorne Roar. Her own name, written not in chalk or in dirt, but permanent, ink on law. Beneath it, space for her to sign. Miriam extended a fountain pen. "No need to hurry," said Ellis, his voice faintly roughened by something that wasn't the fire's smoke. Willa said nothing. She looked down at the pen, then up at Ellis, whose eyes were steady but unreadable. Slowly, she reached for it. Her hand trembled once, then stilled. With small but certain letters, she signed, "Willa Thorne Roar." The moment hung quiet. The ink dried quick in the warmth. Miriam wrapped the deed carefully and handed it to Ellis, who in turn held it out to Willa. She hesitated, then took it with both hands, gripping the curled edges, like it might vanish if she blinked wrong. "It's yours now," he said. "Not from me, from the land, from the work." Willa nodded once. The fire popped, and then, as if pulled by instinct more than thought, she turned and walked to the barn end, nailed the deed high on the beam above the door. "Note hidden, note locked, hung proud." By dusk, the final rays caught her name in gold. Dust rode like a ghost beside Gideon's boots as he dismounted at the edge of Redwood's south pasture paper, clenched in a fine leather folder, lips twisted with certainty. The sun was low, dragging gold across the knotted fence posts, but his presence tried to darken the whole land. Two men trailed behind on lean geldings, official-looking and silent, as if even they knew this was show over substance. Willa stood at the gate. She wore Ellis's sister's coat, again long, lined with old wool and dusty at the hem where it swept her boots. Her shoulders didn't flinch. She held no weapon this time, just herself. "Child," Gideon said, attempting calm, "move aside. This property is now under rightful claim. Signed, sealed, and notarized." She said nothing, just widened her stance slightly, hands at her sides. Ellis's voice was the thunder that followed. "That deed you wave?" All turned as he stepped from the trees, rifle across his back, boots purposeful, jaw set like stone that had seen storms. "It's from when the Wexley name still meant something. Land boundaries changed since then, filed with proper county record. It's old law," Gideon scoffed. "Law's law. Only if it's current," came another voice, Miriam Wells, riding up with dust on her boots and truth in her saddlebag. She dismounted effortlessly, pulling papers from her satchel with a woman's confidence that spared no breath. She handed Willa a document. "I rode from Cartwright," clerk confirmed. "Wexley's deed expired after your father failed to reestablish claim during the drought years. Redwood held title since, and more young Miss Roar stands as co-owner. Co-signed." Murmurs stirred among the two witnesses. One edged backward, towing dust. Gideon snatched the paper, eyes scanning too quickly to take in what mattered. Willa's name, inked bold and even. A girl. A ranch. "It's not rightful," he muttered. "Not blood. No, Ellis said, stepping closer. It's earned. Gideon stood, undone. Boots too polished for this prairie. No crowd to save him, no legacy to hide behind. Just a child staring up with quiet commandant a land that had chosen her. You think a child can hold deed to land? He barked. Land's earned through name of mine, not yours, Willa answered, slow as sunrise. You don't have to yell to guard a place. You only have to stay. The silence that followed was thunder. In the end, Gideon mounted without another word. His last ride was quiet not as a victor, but as a name history forgot, riding away from something he never truly knew how to hold. The morning dawned slow and amber over Redwood Ranch, soaking the hills in light that crawled instead of spilled. Willa stood beneath the crooked pine at the edge of the paddock, hands buried in the deep pockets of Ellis's sister's old coat. Beneath her boots, the ground still held the mark of last week's rain, soft in places, firm in others, much like her. Ellis was already on the ridge, hammer looping at his belt, repairing the north line of fence. He hadn't asked Willa to join that morning, nor had he said why. He simply left her a bundle of biscuits wrapped in linen at the table, and a document sealed in wax beside them. She hadn't opened it yet. Benji ladled water over the painted sign they'd made the day before, letters still smudged in places, uneven where his hands had shaken with excitement. Redwood Ranch! Roar! Willa! Benji! She remembered the way he pressed his finger down beneath his name, as if to make it stick better to the world. She bent and picked up the document. Her name stared back at her in ink darker than pine bark. Willathorn Roar, co-heir of Redwood Ranch, by declaration and designation of Ellis J. Roar, proprietor. It said the land was hers. But that wasn't what made her fingers tremble. What made them tremble was the way the paper felt warm, like embers before flame, like a thing that had waited to be hers. Even now, she half expected someone to ride up and snatch it away, saying it was all a misunderstanding, a kindness never meant to last. Benji hummed behind her, off-key and content. She took the deed and stepped into the barn, careful with the hinges, found a nail Ellis had driven in long ago, unused and crooked. With a touch like reverence, she posted the paper there, right above the coiled rope, not as proof they owned the place, but because the land had accepted them, had waited for the sound of their boots, the swing of their hammers, the quiet strength they built into every fence post every morning. She stepped back, squared her chin. Benji stood beside her. Looks right, he whispered. She nodded, voice soft. It's ours now. No, he said, slipping his hand into hers. We're its. And outside, the wind didn't howl like loneliness anymore. It whispered something close to welcome. The fingers that once clutched a crust of dry cornbread in silence now pressed against weathered parchment, smooth and steady. Willa sat at the little desk in the corner of the barn loft, where the slats let in just enough golden light to warm the page. Her boots dangled several inches from the floor, but her shoulders were square, her spine straight with purpose. A jar of ink, half frozen the winter before, sat proudly beside the nib. Ellis had left it there days ago without a word. The letter was slow in coming, not for lack of words, but because so many of them had never been spoken aloud, not back then, and not by the kind of girl who got left behind in the dust of a trail. She began, "To the girl alone on the wagon track, you did not cry. That's what I remember first. You stood with your sack, your knees scabbed and your throat parched, and waited without hope because someone had already taught you that hope was a trick of hungry hearts. But a man came, quiet as sunrise. He didn't ask what you'd done to be left there, didn't reach for your hand. He only said, "Let's go, Willa," and you did. You walked, not because you trusted, but because you had nowhere else to walk. You didn't know then that home was something you could build. That silence could be warm if shared near enough a fire. That a man with calloused hands and eyes that saw without prying could teach a girl how to ride, fence, track, and, most strange of all, belong. You didn't know you'd defend that land one day, that your voice would hold steadier than the shotgun, that your name could be inked beside his, paper proof of something deeper than blood. You didn't know you'd find another Benji, small and shaking, and that you'd see yourself in him and choose him anyway, because that's what someone once did for you. And now you hang this letter here. For her barefoot, dust, smeared, braver than she knew, you tell her this: you will not be forgotten. You are not the trail. You are the roots that found earth. With fire, Willa Thorn, roar. She folded the paper once, pressed it flat. Then, careful as lighting a match, she tacked it beneath the family deed nailed to the barn wall. 2 pieces of quiet truth-proof and promise held still beneath a golden beam.